All right, here we are back at the 80s. Did you figure it out? Did you guess? Who's Wolf Dog in this classic photo from 1982? If you guessed the little girl in the pink, that was me. Ding, 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 ding. All right, so in the 1980s, there was a conservative tide that happened. It was kind of led by this gentleman right here on the left, sitting next to President Ronald Reagan. His name was Jerry Falwell, and he was a religious leader who spearheaded a coalition of evangelical voters called the Moral Majority. And he was responding to issues of growth in government and decisions like the 1973 Roe versus Wade case that legalized abortion. This is essentially a modern religious revival, but instead of like people being intense like they were during the first and second Great Awakening, they are now using television. These are televangelists, Tammy Faye Baker. And he really sort of coalesces this group to become a pretty powerful block of voters. And you can kind of see this. One of the things that these conservative voters were upset with was these growing entitlement programs, like welfare and the high cost of taxpayers, and a perception that there was fraud within these programs. And that perception is still around. They were also skeptics of civil rights legislation, for example, busing. And you can also start to see the party realignment in the South after civil rights. So this is 1976, and you can see this is the Jimmy Carter election. And, you know, Carter really has a stronghold still in the strongly Democratic South. But these groups were anti-affirmative action. And their goals were to promote small government, traditional values, and patriotism and business. And what you start to see in the 1980s is this shift. The blue disappears. And the South becomes a Republican stronghold, starting in around 1968, but it really takes off in the 70s. Remember, all of those folks prior to the civil rights movement had been very strongly Democratic, and now they're switching parties. So Ronald Reagan was a former governor of California. Oh, I spelled his name wrong. There should be a D. His vice presidential candidate was George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. And his big issues in his campaign were the Iranian crisis and the economy. He was kind of known as the great communicator. So one of the things that he was known to say is government is not the solution to our problem. Government is our problem. He was devoted to fiscal fitness in the budget. He wanted to shrink the federal budget and cut taxes. He proposed cutting $35 billion in funding, mostly from social welfare programs, including things like Medicaid, Medicare, education, etc. Congress approved the tax reforms and lowered the individual income tax rates and reduced federal estate taxes. That's the money you would pay if you inherited money upon the death of a parent. And they created a new tax-free saving plan for small investors. This becomes known as supply-side economics, and it was known as supply-side economics before, and then it becomes called Reaganomics. And this emphasizes the importance of tax cuts and business incentives to encourage economic growth. The idea is that you have that money in your pocket and you will then spend it, which causes businesses to grow their businesses, etc. And if you give businesses incentives and tax breaks, they will then reinvest in their businesses in new machinery, new employees, etc. And it just increases the overall economy is the idea. So here you go. Here's the president touting his tax plan on television. This becomes known as Reaganomics, and some of his critics said that really these tax cuts were being burdening the people who had the least in our economy, and it was, some people argued, furthering our recession. So there were a lot of people unemployed, a lot of people crabby about it. So some of his economic legacy, though promising to increase government revenue, his supply-side economics actually ended up creating a large revenue hole, and nearly $2 trillion was added to the national debt during his 8 years in office. He was successful in slowing down the growth of the government, though, which is one of his goals, and containing what he called the welfare state and keeping business and or government small. The 1980s also reversed the trend of more equitable distribution. So during the 50s, 60s, we saw a period where incomes were pretty evenly distributed. We had a growing middle class. You didn't really have two classes, the rich and the not rich. You had a broad range of incomes, and now you start to see the squeezing of the middle class. The median household income dropped from $33,000 in 1989 to $31,000 in 1993. So we're actually losing revenue. Sandra Day O'Connor. So let's talk about the legacy of the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor is appointed under Reagan as the first woman to the Supreme Court. And with her appointment, the court gets progressively more conservative. The president then appoints Clarence Thomas, Clarence Thomas was approved by the Senate despite being accused of sexual harassment of Anita Hill, who had been one of his law clerks. Throughout this time period, you start to see the Supreme Court restricting access to abortion and limiting the extent of civil rights laws. There's some big social concerns in the 80s and go into the 90s. You have HIV and AIDS, which starts as a disease in primarily gay communities, but then very quickly spreads to the heterosexual community, and it becomes a disease of, IV drug users too. You have very heated debates about abortion. You have further urban decay as whites continue to move to the suburbs, and you see this sort of ethnic groups segregating themselves within these urban places, and this sort of comes to a head in the early 90s with the race riots after the Rodney King verdict. Rodney King was brutally beaten and videotaped. Sounds scarily familiar to what we've seen recently. And when the policemen were not indicted on charges, race riots broke out in LA. The ERA was not ratified. The Supreme Court limited affirmative action, and gay rights becomes an issue. All the way into Clinton's administration, Clinton gets Congress to pass the Defense of Marriage Act, which actually defined in 1996 marriage as between one man and one woman. So we're coming full circle on that one. So here you have the riots in LA. You also have a war on drugs, and Nancy Reagan, the president's wife, sort of headed up this. There were a lot of negative media portrayals of the use of crack and heroin during the 80s, and this caused state legislatures to push zero tolerance policies, 3 strikes you're outlaws, and mandatory minimum sentencing, which means that if you get caught with something, you're going to jail for a mandatory amount of time. And we see a pretty high increase in incarceration rates in the United States at this point. All right. If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall. One of the most famous Ronald Reagan quotes. And it's during this late 80s period that communism actually collapses. Gorbachev institutes economic reforms in the Soviet Union, and ultimately that leads to its collapse. The Berlin Wall collapses. Yugoslavia collapses and falls into a civil war, and unfortunately that civil war devolves into a genocide in the early 90s that required the United States to bomb the city of Kosovo with the United Nations. You also have a pro-democracy movement in China where students occupy Tiananmen Square and face down tanks, and the communists send in tanks and kill thousands of students. So here's the Berlin Wall. In Latin America, we're still pursuing a policy of containment. In Nicaragua, Reagan supported anti-communist Contras against the communist Sandinistas. In Grenada, we invaded with U.S. troops to replace a pro-Cuban government with a pro-U.S. government. And then we oust the dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, partly because he was close enough to the Panama Canal that it made us nervous. And we managed to get him sentenced and charged to 40 years in jail for drug charges. One of the things that you couldn't do, though, was you could not negotiate with Iran. And in 1983, terrorists loyal to Iran took Americans hostage in Lebanon. And so Reagan, in order to get around this, you can't negotiate with terrorists, agrees to sell arms to Iran for the hostages, but he has to run the money through another place to make sure that he wasn't getting into trouble there, and that he was also not getting into trouble with the Boland Amendment, which said that you couldn't give money to the Contras. And he did it all anyway, but then he claimed he didn't know and he didn't remember. Congress holds hearings, and a bunch of staffers, including Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, get in trouble. Oliver North said that the president knew, and the president was like, I don't remember. And it was a big to-do and kind of the undoing of Oliver North. Then in 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait for oil, and this threatens the U.S. oil supply. And Saddam Hussein does this because he had been at war with Iran for many years and had racked up a huge war debt, and so he needed to be able to control those oil fields, sell the oil, and make money for his country. An international coalition was put together to fight Saddam Hussein and kick him out of Kuwait, and we did that pretty fast with these two generals, and that was the first war in Iraq. So there you have it, the 80s. Basically what I remember is I want my MTV.